Hello, and welcome to another episode of the albums that shaped me. And as you can probably hear, I have a big smile on my face at the moment as I'm thinking about this album. It's Rainbow's Long Live Rock and Roll. So this week's going to be different from last week in as much as when I was talking about Rush, one thing I mentioned is when I listened to Rush, what it primarily made me do is want to listen to more Rush. Slightly different with Rainbow. Rainbow acted as a bit more of a gateway band to other things, and in this episode I'm going to talk about some of those other things. In fact, it's so broad I'm not going to be able to cover anything. Be able to cover everything, but you'll get a feel for where it took me. So let's try and establish a bit of background here, because it's interesting how I discovered Rainbow. I had probably no idea, I think, that they existed until a fateful day in 1980. And I may have even mentioned this when I've spoken about the Friday Rock Show. So let's go back to 1980. And the Friday Rock Show was definitely responsible for this. But there's an interesting causal crossroads here as to how I ended up stumbling across the Friday Rock Show and then a particular track by Rainbow, which then led me to Long Live Rock and Roll. So I would say, let me think about this now. So as I've mentioned before, I left school in 81 after staying on an extra year. So November 1980 was when I first heard the Friday Rock Show. It had been running for a year, since 1978. And since let me think about this, so I would have been, I'm trying to think how old I would have had to have been. I suppose it doesn't really matter so much, but at a certain age, and definitely before I was 18, I started going to the Forest Row Social Club. So this is a map of Forest Row. The only reason it's on here is because to get there, I used to have to walk from my house, which is around here. So it is Ashdown Forest is over here. So I think I mentioned in another episode, not about music, I lived right on the doorstep of Ashdown Forest, right near the cricket club. And the social club is down here. This is actually the old disused railway line. You can actually walk down this still. And after that was decommissioned, I think it would have been really early, I suppose late 60s maybe. They built a number of things down here, of which the social club was one. There was a scout hut down here and the fire station's down here. And then since then, over the years, they've added a proper industrial estate. The social club's still there. And it's really, I suppose, built on where the railway line used to run. So what you find is if you walk down the disused railway line, you can walk, this is now like a nature trail, I suppose, for want of a better word. What do they call it? Yeah, the Forest Way. So you can walk down the Forest Way, and then down here you sort of have to veer off, and then you can walk down another road and then rejoin it on the other side of what's called the A22. So yeah, that's where the social club was, on the site of the old, well, I suppose at the site of the old Forest Row station. And you can still see the platform over by where the scout hut is as well. So obviously I used to walk down here and then walk back. So I worked it out. This is about a 17-minute journey, and you'll see why this is important. So I think this is quite amusing. The Friday Rock Show started at 9, and I used to walk back. I used to come home around about 9 o'clock. Meet my mates down there, have a few games of pool, snooker, play the Space Invaders machines, those sort of things. And they had like a junior membership, which I think you could become. I'm never sure whether it was a junior member at 16 or 14. Maybe it was 16 actually. And the other thing I liked down there was limeade was all the rage. So I'd have a limeade, a Mars bar. I think my dad would give me £1, and then that was enough for a whole load of games on the Space Invaders machines. So I'd walk back from there around 9 o'clock, and then what I'd do is, my dad had, I think again I've mentioned in other episodes about albums, my dad had this really nice cassette player at the time, so I'd come in and play my Queen albums for about an hour. And anyway, what would happen is I'd switched on the unit, and it would be tuned into Radio 1, and it was doing a rundown on this show, on this Friday Rock Show, which I hadn't paid a lot of attention to before, funnily enough. Maybe it was the first time I'd, stuck the stereo on and listened to Queen on a Friday night, I'm not sure. And they were playing this track, Stargazer. So I listened to it to the end. I found out it was by Rainbow, and I don't think I recognised, and then proceeded to listen to the rest of the show. And this used to run from, I think, 9 through to 11, something like that. Let me just check that. So, what was it? So it started in 78, and from 10, so that was from 10 to midnight. Okay, so that's a lot later than I thought. Just trying to think why I missed the first. Maybe I was out a lot later than 9 that particular evening. Maybe that was it. So yeah. So anyway, the point is that for some reason I just happened to switch on at that moment, like fate would have it. So this would have, the We Are Now One would have been broadcast on 17th of November 79. So anyway, fast forward a little bit, I started to listen to the Friday Rock Show a lot, but so 79 November, so we're getting into 1980, and then I have this memory of going to the record store where someone that I went to school with used to work, and they were working there that evening after school, and buying on the strength of, so I heard Stargazer, and then during the course of probably, I don't know, early 1980 into mid 1980, whenever I started sixth form college. So sorry, not college, started the sixth form. I heard some other stuff like Kill the King, those sort of things. And as a consequence, when I went into the record store, for some reason I didn't buy the album, which is Rainbow Rising. I didn't buy that till later on cassette. I bought this. And I think what it might have happened is that I listened to or had heard a live track that was played on the Friday Rock Show, and it was a live version of Kill the King. And I must have thought that maybe this was a live album, being it was called Long Live Rock and Roll. And when you open it, I've got the gatefold sleeve, I still have this album. It's got this picture of a live gig, I think, if my memory serves me correctly, without... Hang on. Grab this. I don't know if it's in its... Oh, it's not in a gatefold. It is gatefold, but it's in a sleeve. Yeah, so it's a live gig, and they've got this, looks like a superimposed poster with the words "Long Live Rock and Roll" on it. So mistakenly, I don't know why, I thought perhaps it was a live album, because it was that time, no internet, and naive 16-year-old, unaware of the back catalogue of a band. You made these strange purchases. But I really love the album, and of course it's got real classics on this. Let's go down to the track listing. Yeah, Long Live Rock and Roll, Lady of the Lake, Gates of Babylon, Kill the King, and so on. So, and of course back then, you'd buy an album and it would have to last you several months. So yeah, so that was the first album I bought. But yeah, the album came out in, was it 78? And I didn't buy it till, well, sometime after, when would I have gone back to school? So September 1980. So all through that period I'd been sort of drip fed different Rainbow tracks I heard on the Friday Rock Show, alongside all of the Nwubum stuff which I was sort of getting into as a result of listening to the show. So from the point I listened to the show, that's really for several years going forward, had a massive influence on the music I was listening to. But this was really ground zero in the fact that, well, this track, no, like I said, it's not on the album, was ground zero, and Rainbow were ground zero because that happened to be the band and the track that I heard when I first tuned in. Why I didn't buy Rainbow Rising at the time, I don't know. Maybe they didn't just have it in stock at the shop, and I never thought to ask them to order it. So just out of interest, as I normally do, I thought I'd look and see when it actually came out originally, which obviously wasn't the time I bought it, but just what else came out around that period. So this is April of 78. So we've got first Gen X album, Another Music in a Different Kitchen. So this is in the previous month. It's funny to think how Quiet Riot were actually around in 78. A lot of people don't realise early, and there you have a very young Randy Rhoads. And yeah, there's interesting layers to this episode, which we'll get onto. How a load of stuff like loops back on itself, but that's another possible connection, as you might see in a moment. Genesis, and then there were three. North Winds by David Coverdale. That's his second album after leaving Deep Purple. REO Speedwagon. First Glance by April Wine. I'm not sure whether that was before or after Harder Faster. And we'll come on to April Wine as well in a moment as well. Squeeze first, that's the first album I assume, yeah. Oh, Dixie Dregs. Lots of interesting cross connections here actually. Heaven Tonight by Cheap Trick. So that was their third studio album. Yeah, there will be an episode that does talk about Cheap Trick, but that comes slightly later chronologically after this, I think. Although, yeah, loosely around the same time. so on. That's an interesting album. First Only Ones album, although I didn't listen to that till many years later. So yeah, another Power Age by AC/DC. We're now getting a bit further, we're getting into May now. Of course, Eternally Yours by the Saints. They're a cool band. Man Machine by Kraftwerk. See, quite a bit here where it took a number of years before I got round to listening to a lot of this stuff I've highlighted. So in terms of the Rainbow stuff, as I said, at the time they didn't get me into listening to more Rainbow. So after Long Live Rock and Roll came out, and as I said, I didn't buy that until 1980. They had a bit of a good run on the UK charts because at this point Ronnie James Dio was out of the band and Graham Bonnet was in the band, and they had at least 2 singles. So they had 2 singles off of Down to Earth, I think, All Night Long, Since You've Been Gone, which were both chart hits in the UK. And then if we go on to Difficult to Cure in 81, they had I Surrender. Now by this time they changed their vocalist again to Jolene Turner, who also at some point ended up fronting one version of Yngwie's band as well. So yeah, this this is funny. There's loads of stuff I'm not going to mention in this episode, but all these really weird interconnections actually. And like I said, I was trying to think why I didn't go down the rabbit hole, and really all I did was later on I bought Rising, and then at some point I think a friend had this, so I was able to listen to that. It wasn't until years later, and I'm talking about years later, until sometime in the 2000s where I was infilling buying CDs of albums I didn't have alongside stuff I probably did, that I actually went through and bought all of these albums through to this point on CD. So yeah, so it was years later that I infilled. But what was interesting is what actually happened next, because with Dio out of the band, he goes on to join Sabbath and records Heaven and Hell around the time, or just before, when I picked up Long Live Rock and Roll by Rainbow. So at some point on the Friday Rock Show, they played a track off of Heaven and Hell by Black Sabbath, and immediately I'm thinking, well, I recognise that voice. I think it must have been Die Young. And yeah, not long after I heard it, and like I said, it must have been after me buying, after, I don't know, sometime in the autumn of 1980, after buying the Rainbow album, I bought this, and I still have this. And then I went on a bit of a Black Sabbath jag for a while, both myself and my brothers. So I bought this album, and that alongside someone at school playing early Sabbath albums real loud in the sixth form common room led me to explore their back catalogue. So as a collective, me and my brothers went back and we all bought various early Black Sabbath catalogues. So yeah, Black Sabbath, Paranoid, Master of Reality. I think we had my volume 4 in the house. I had Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath. So all of my brothers, my 2 brothers, had these 4 between them, I think. Oh, and Sabotage as well. We didn't buy Technical Ecstasy or Never Say Die. I later bought Mob Rules. And then years later, around the time I was infilling on Amazon, I don't know if anybody remembers, but there was a box set of the Aussie years done in these little facsimile CD slipcases that looked like the original albums as a box set. I actually bought that and then proceeded to track down all of these on individual CDs and ended up buying them, except I didn't buy 13, I don't think. Well, by then I was on Spotify, but yeah, so I have all of these on CD, but that was all done in the 2000s. But it was really funny how it took me until Heaven and Hell to really explore the back catalogue, and part of that was my gateway into hard rock, heavy metal, was through Nwubum. And at the time I got this real vibe of a lot of bands, and I suppose it was more off the punk ethos, were a bit anti the Dinosaurs. At least that's the impression I got. So, probably incorrectly, when you hear about, the people's influences subsequently. But so I wasn't big into listening to Led Zeppelin or Deep Purple or Black Sabbath, beyond just the occasional listen around friends' houses. Not that I disliked it, but I had more pressing interests. So you could say that it was really as a result of listening to Rainbow, it made me, reappreciate some of the dinosaur bands from the sort of early hard rock heavy metal. I mean, I didn't really include bands like, Motorhead or Judas Priest in that group, but certainly our bands before that period, it got me listening to them a lot more. The other interesting thing is I picked up this album around the same time, so this Monsters of Rock album. So that had Rainbow, Scorpions, April Wine, Saxon, Riot, Touch. Funnily enough, Judas Priest did play, but for licensing reasons, they're not featured on this album. Still have this album. Pretty cool album. And that got me thinking about, the history of Monsters of Rock. So here's the listing. So that was the very first Monsters of Rock. And at that point, so then that would have been, 1980, the singer would have been, I think Graham Bonnet was still in the band. So Graham Bonnet. Not sure exactly when he left, but he's definitely on the recording. It's just his name escaped me there. Well, here's another interesting connection. So years later, in the 2000s, there was a Monsters of Rock on tour thing in Brighton in 2002. This was the tour where they stopped off in the UK. It had Dogs D'Amour, Choir Boys, Thunder, Alice Cooper. I think that was it. Was it 4 bands? Yeah. Why do I think there was a fifth? No, 4. 4 bands. So Dogs D'Amour, Choir Boys, Thunder, and then Alice Cooper. And I went to this one with a friend. I had a spare ticket and I asked him if he wanted to go. And then the following year, he wasn't really his style of music, but he really got into it. So he wanted to go the following year. So we went to this one, which was Whitesnake with Gary Moore and Y&T. and they stopped off at the Brighton Centre as well. And then roll forward, same, so Brighton Centre, but not part of this Monsters of Rock thing. Heaven and Hell, the band, which was this lineup of Tony Iommi, Geezer Butler, Ronnie James Dio, and at that point Vinny Appice, because if anybody remembers, there's a period in Black Sabbath when Dio joined and Bill Ward actually stepped back for a period of time when they were touring. So there was a touring lineup with Vinny Appice. And when they decided to do this sort of version of a supergroup, they decided to call Heaven and Hell. Bill Ward, I believe, was actually on Heaven and Hell. Let me just check that. Yeah, he was on it. But he didn't, I think he didn't tour, that was the thing. Or there's part of the tour he didn't appear on. And I was actually just going to check, because didn't Vinny Appice play on Mob Rules? Yeah, so it was on Mob Rules. But they just elected it to call it Heaven and Hell. And it was a pretty cool gig. Went down that with actually a different group. No, that was an interesting one. There's loads of us down there, because now it's come back to me. And I may have told this story before. I had some friends who actually saw the original tour back when Dio was fronting Black Sabbath, and they played in Brighton. So I got in touch with a load of my mates and said, look, there's this band Heaven and Hell. It's got that the tour lineup. Why don't we all go down? So, I think about 3 sets of us all went down in different cars. I had a group of friends I was meeting down in Brighton, and we were hanging around in Brighton that day. It's funny, it's another one where I had a spare ticket because a friend backed out at the last minute, and so another friend that I hadn't seen for a while came down as well. So it was really cool. It was a nice evening out. So that was good. That brings back memories. But it's funny how, when you've been listening to bands a long time, you get these weird synchronicities as well later on as well. So yeah, very cool. Yeah, 2007, that was when the tour was. And yeah, Dio the band sounded awesome, but yeah, Dio his voice was amazing. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to do my usual thing at the end here, just to finish this up. So firstly, let me just bring up, I did run my little album recommendation programs. So when I ran the Spotify thing that I've got together and did the Pareto analysis, I explained this in a previous episode, so I'm not going to re-explain how this works. It's interesting to see, with Rainbow as the seed band, who you end up with as predominantly coming up as similar bands at 2 levels. So you got Rainbow, Michael Schenker Group, Saxon Crocus, UFO, Dio, Heaven and Hell, except Judas Priest, Wasp, Udo, Uriah, Heep, Bruce Dickinson, Halfords, Sabotage. All of these bands I've either bought albums by, listened to, or some of them actually seen live in some capacity. So you could say it's the usual old school hard rock stroke heavy metal-ish bands, classic bands. When I ran the LastFM one, just for similar matches, I got this. Obviously this one does albums that come up top of the list on LastFM, but not a dissimilar list. I think, as I've mentioned before, I normally look down to about a 0.5 similarity, but yeah, you can see like Alcatraz, and just because of the amount of different lineups of, over the years, I'm talking about the whole of Sabbath's history, and the lineups of Rainbow, and things like that. There's all these associated acts where members of other bands like crop up as well, and obviously the bands that they were previously in, like with the Rainbow, with Richie Blackmore being in Deep Purple. So it's funny, there's a lot of commonality with some of these bands in terms of band members. Black Sabbath, Rainbow, Deep Purple, Family Tree, and then if you mix in, I suppose, Whitesnake as well, it's pretty crazy to look at. And then finally, let's do a couple of Bing things. So I always run the same sort of thing. This is the one you've seen before on previous episodes. So this is the prompt, where this time I've just changed the band to Rainbow, and it's going to list bands in the same era, hopefully. So 5 bands and studio albums. So let's see what happens. It was funny trying to find information about the Monsters of Rock on tour thing was actually quite difficult. Some of it's very well documented, but the tours in the UK in the early 2000s are quite difficult to find out about, and I needed to jog my memory. Rainbow Rising, no surprise. Judas Priest, okay, what's it going to be? British Steel, Scorpions, yeah, UFO, oh yeah, these are all going to feature in future episodes anyway for various reasons, although I suspect a lot of them will go back to the Friday Rock Show. Thin Lizzy, Jailbreak, and what Deep Purple album? Machine Head. Well, you'll be pleased to know I own all of those albums, probably multiple times over. So let's have a look at bands generally that are considered to be the same as Rainbow, or similar to Rainbow, regardless of era. So this is the one sometimes where it pays to actually say 10 instead of just 5, but I like to keep things relatively short. Slow today, well, yeah, Rainbow Rising, that'll be the same. Yeah, the onstage Rainbow from their original touring days actually dates back to, I've seen images of it in Deep Purple days actually. So now we've got Machine Head, Deep Purple, Dio, Holy Diver. Oh, there you go, Rising Force by Yngwie Malmsteen. Halloween, Keeper of the Seven Keys. So we're definitely in power metal territory here, probably. Although, yeah, so we've got neoclassical elements here. I would say Dio definitely, big influence on power metal artists. So that's a pretty cool list actually. In terms of these albums, I have that. Holy Diver. It's interesting. I think I might have the one off. Yeah, I'm not sure. I might have that on CD. But of course, again, it's always available on Spotify. Definitely that. And yeah, that. Yeah, these I have on cassettes. I don't have access to anything on cassette. I don't really have direct access to anymore. And never really listened to much Stradivarius. Any Stradivarius fans out there watching this? Let me know what you think of them. I should check them out. I suppose I always associated them as being more of a symphonic metal band. But yeah, I should check those out. Check the band out, actually. Okay, so hopefully you've enjoyed that trip down memory lane as part of the Albums That Shaped Me series. And that was me rambling on about Rainbow's Long Live Rock and Roll, or probably more specifically what it led to. So thanks once again for watching. Bye for now, and I will catch you in the next episode.